She had been told to expect cruelty, but nothing prepared her for what awaited inside the camp. A young Japanese nurse, barely 20, sat trembling on a rough wooden bench, her uniform torn and stained with blood. The canvas walls around her sagged under the weight of damp air, and the sharp scent of disinfectant mixed with the earthy smell of wet soil. She clutched her wounded arm tightly, bracing herself for the rifle, but her mocking laughter she had been warned about since training. Her commanders had promised her that capture meant humiliation, degradation, and torment so severe that death itself would seem merciful. When the flap of the tent opened, she flinched. An American medic stepped inside, his boots muddy, his expression calm. She expected contempt, perhaps violence. Instead, he knelt before her and gently examined her wound. His voice carried no hatred, only quiet reassurance she could not understand, but somehow felt. With deliberate care, he wound a fresh white bandage around her arm, the cloth soft against her bruised skin. She stared at it in disbelief, wondering if this tenderness was a trick, some cruel game before the torment began. Around her, other women sat with steaming bowls of stew, eating more in a single meal than they had in weeks. The aroma of broth and bread filled the air, alien yet comforting. She had whispered an oath to die before surrender, yet here she was alive, tended to, and fed by those she was taught to call monsters. This was not paradise, at least not yet. It was confusion, shock, and the unsettling spark of curiosity. If this was captivity, what had her empire truly hidden from her? If you're intrigued by this story, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Only on Requiem of Fear. For generations, the Japanese people had been raised under a code older than the empire itself. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Born in the era of the samurai, it taught loyalty, sacrifice, and above all, the belief that surrender was worse than death. By the time the Second World War engulfed Asia and the Pacific, this code was not just for warriors. It had seeped into classrooms, hospitals, and even the training grounds for young women pressed into service. To surrender meant more than laying down arms. It meant disgracing one's family, dishonoring ancestors, and betraying the emperor, believed to be divine. Shame was not individual. It spread like a stain, touching parents, siblings, and even unborn generations. Better to die bravely than to live as a prisoner. That was the lesson whispered by instructors, reinforced by propaganda posters, and repeated endlessly in military drills. Young women, including nurses and clerks who followed the army into foreign lands, absorbed these ideas as deeply as any soldier. Before leaving for the front, many recited oaths declaring they would never allow themselves to be captured alive. They were told that American troops were monsters, brutal men who would degrade and torture them until death was a mercy. Newspapers painted grotesque images of enemy cruelty. Radio broadcasts warned that surrender was a path to humiliation beyond imagination. Families, too, expected unwavering loyalty. Mothers told their daughters to embrace death before dishonor. Fathers demanded courage without compromise, and neighbors shamed those who faltered. To be taken prisoner was not merely a military failure. It was a moral collapse that erased all worth. The empire made sure its citizens believed this with unwavering conviction. And so, when the first groups of women were captured, they carried this heavy burden. Fear consumed them, not only of what the Americans might do, but of what their own country would think. Every step behind enemy lines felt like stepping deeper into disgrace. Some whispered prayers for a quick execution rather than a slow degradation. Others clutched at their training, reminding themselves that pain was loyalty, that suffering was proof of devotion. What they did not know was that their beliefs would soon collide with a reality, so alien it would shake the very foundation of their identity. Instead of humiliation, they would face kindness. Instead of starvation, they would be fed. Instead of scorn, they would find recognition of their humanity. The Empire had armed them with myths. The Americans would disarm them with something far more subversive: compassion. The stage was set for a clash not of weapons, but of worldviews. A collision that would transform every woman who stepped beyond the barbed wire. When the first Japanese women stepped into American captivity, their bodies stiffened with dread. Every lesson, every command drilled into them had promised that this moment would be the beginning of unspeakable torment. They braced for blows, for jeers, for the gaze of victors who would strip them of dignity. Some whispered final prayers, expecting that the next breath would be their last. But the cruelty never came. Instead, something entirely unthinkable happened. One young nurse, her arm still raw from a shrapnel wound, flinched as an American medic approached. She expected a strike. Instead, he gently examined her wound, frowning with concern, and wrapped it in a clean white bandage. The cloth was fresh, the touch steady, and the act itself so ordinary for him. But for her, it shattered years of propaganda in an instant. She stared at the bandage as though it were an illusion. Nearby, other women sat clutching bowls of steaming stew, their fingers trembling. The smell of broth and bread was overwhelming. Some refused at first, convinced the food was poisoned. Others ate cautiously, tasting meat and vegetables they had not seen in months. Tears rolled silently down one woman's face as she swallowed. To cry over food might have seemed absurd, but hunger had carved deep scars into their bodies. In that moment, the stew was not just nourishment. It was a revelation that their captors saw them as human. Even the simplest gestures struck with disorienting force. One guard handed out cigarettes. Another passed a canteen of clean water. Instead of ridicule, there were nods and quiet words they could not understand but recognized as calm. For women who had been trained to expect brutality, these small kindnesses were as destabilizing as any battlefield ambush. At night, the strangeness deepened. The camp did not echo with shouted orders or ritual punishments. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the murmur of guards talking among themselves or the faint notes of a harmonica carried across the barracks. For some women, the quiet itself was unbearable, as though the absence of cruelty was a trick waiting to collapse. Yet slowly, suspicion began to erode. The first time one of the prisoners was offered coffee, she hesitated, staring at the steaming cup as if it were a weapon. She had never tasted it before. When she finally took a sip, the bitterness startled her tongue, and she coughed. The medic chuckled softly, shaking his head. That small laugh, a human sound from the mouth of an enemy, pierced her armor more deeply than any bullet. Blankets, beds, and clean uniforms followed. To the Americans, these were ordinary, expected provisions. To the women, they were luxuries bordering on miracles. Each blanket felt like an admission that their lives mattered. Each bed a reminder that rest was not shameful. Each clean dress a recognition of dignity long denied. What unsettled them most was not the food or the bandages, but the contradiction itself. For years they had been told capture was worse than death. Yet here, behind barbed wire, they were alive, fed, and treated with a kindness their own commanders had never shown. This was the great irony. Captivity felt safer, more humane, even more nourishing than the freedom promised by their empire. And with every bowl of soup, every bandage, every moment of quiet, a dangerous question began to rise in their minds. Had everything they'd been taught been a lie? To fully grasp the disorienting experience of Japanese women in American custody, one must understand the abyss between what they endured under their own empire and what they witnessed behind enemy fences. The contrast was not merely striking, it was grotesque in its imbalance. In Japanese camps across Asia, Allied prisoners lived through a daily nightmare. Rations were so meager that men wasted away to skeletons, often surviving on fewer than 200 calories a day. Bamboo cages held those accused of disobedience, their bodies left to rot in humidity and disease. Work was relentless. Mines, construction sites, and jungle clearings where fever and exhaustion claimed lives faster than bullets. 1 in 3 Allied prisoners would not survive captivity under the Japanese. For them, the words prison camp meant degradation, starvation, and death. Now place that against the reality inside American camps for Japanese captives. Here, women were handed trays of eggs, bread, and steaming coffee each morning. They were given real beds with blankets instead of dirt floors. Uniforms were washed, wounds were treated, and letters home were allowed, even encouraged. The Geneva Convention was not a perfect shield, but it was a guiding principle. To Americans, a prisoner was not a broken enemy to be discarded, but a resource, a potential source of intelligence, propaganda, and even moral high ground. For the Japanese women, the comparison cut especially deep. They remembered officers who struck subordinates across the face for faltering. They remembered rice rations stretched with bark, or soldiers abandoned when too weak to march. Their own empire treated them as expendable cogs. Yet here, their supposed enemies treated them as individuals worth preserving. This irony became unbearable. Captivity with the Americans offered more nourishment, more dignity, and more humanity than freedom under their own flag. That realization was like a crack spreading through solid stone. If the empire had lied about the enemy's cruelty, what else had it lied about? The women did not yet have answers, only questions. Questions whispered in the dark of the barracks, scribbled in intercepted letters, and carried silently in their hearts. It was in this tension between myth and reality that their transformation began. The transformation of captivity began not with grand gestures, but with the smallest of moments, tiny cracks in the wall of fear that the empire had built around these women. The first came with food. For months, their stomachs had known only gnawing emptiness, rice rations stretched with bark or sawdust. Now, in the American camp, steaming trays of bread and eggs greeted them at dawn. At first, the women refused to touch them, convinced this was a cruel test. One whispered that the food must be poisoned. Another tucked bread into her sleeve, certain the kindness would be snatched away. But when they saw guards eating from the same plates, smiling, speaking softly, chewing without hesitation, the suspicion began to crumble. One young nurse lifted her fork with trembling fingers. The first bite of egg jolted her body awake, tears stinging her eyes. Across the room, another woman laughed nervously, covering her mouth in shame. Yet no punishment followed. No officer barked orders. The guards only glanced curiously, as though laughter was permitted, even here. Then came the discovery of blankets. After nights spent on dirt floors or bamboo mats, lying down on a thin mattress with a real blanket felt almost indecent. Comfort had always been seen as weakness, something to be stripped away in service of the empire. Yet when one prisoner gripped her blanket tightly, afraid it might be stolen, she realized it was hers alone. For the first time since leaving home, she owned something that brought warmth. That blanket became a symbol, not of indulgence but of worth. And then, the shock of silence. Nights in the camp were not filled with shouted commands or ritual punishments, but with the faint hum of guards talking quietly, sometimes the drifting notes of a harmonica. Some women lay awake, unable to sleep, convinced the silence must hide a trap. But as the days passed, the silence became something else. Proof that cruelty was not inevitable. Each of these moments, food, blankets, silence, was small, almost ordinary. Yet to women taught that captivity meant only shame, they struck with the force of revelation. The moment of greatest disbelief came with a simple cup of coffee. One afternoon, a medic handed a steaming tin mug to a young nurse, gesturing for her to drink. She hesitated, her hands trembling. Coffee was unknown to her, a foreign drink she had only heard whispers of. Surely this bitter-smelling liquid was a trick, something meant to humiliate her. Yet the medic's expression was calm, almost amused, as though he were offering it to a friend. At last, she raised the mug to her lips. The bitterness exploded across her tongue, and she coughed in surprise. The medic chuckled softly, shaking his head with a smile. That laugh, so ordinary, pierced her defenses more deeply than any weapon. In that sound she heard not mockery, but humanity. If coffee was a shock, then letters were a revelation. One day, the women were given pencils and paper and told they could write home. The silence in the barracks was thick with disbelief. Write to their families? Impossible! The Empire had promised such freedoms would never be allowed. Yet here it was, blank pages waiting for their words. Slowly, hesitant lines appeared. One woman wrote of the meals, another of the clean beds, another of the doctors who changed bandages without cruelty. The young nurse, staring at her page, finally wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They treat me kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." Though many letters would never reach Japan, the act of writing itself cracked the story they had been told. Evenings brought something they had long forgotten: music. In one camp, a guard pulled out a harmonica and played clumsy notes under the dim light. Later, a piano appeared, and prisoners took turns pressing hesitant melodies into the air. The sound was not for ceremony, not for war, but for beauty alone. Women sat with eyes closed, letting the notes wash over them, tasting something they had thought lost forever: joy without consequence. These moments were not luxuries. They were revolutions disguised as ordinary life. Each cup of coffee, each line on paper, each note of music whispered a dangerous idea: that dignity could bloom even behind barbed wire. If food, blankets, and music had softened their fear, it was peanut butter that finally broke it. One afternoon, the women were handed small tins of the strange brown paste. They dipped cautious fingers into it, sniffed suspiciously, then licked. The first taste twisted their faces in betrayal, sticky, salty, clinging to their tongues. One spat it out instantly, to the laughter of both prisoners and guards. Another tried again, grimacing, before breaking into a reluctant smile. Soon, laughter spread across the barracks, hesitant but genuine. In that shared humor lay a crack in the wall of fear, a reminder that even enemies could laugh together over something so absurd. Then came spectacles. A nurse who had squinted for years, her world a blur of shapes and shadows, was led to a camp doctor. Moments later, she was fitted with a pair of glasses. When she slipped them on, the world sharpened into clarity. Faces distinct, edges sharp, letters legible. Tears welled in her eyes. "No one should live in a blur," the doctor said softly, and though she understood only fragments of his words, the meaning struck deep. For the first time in years, she saw not only the camp, but herself clearly. That gift was more than medical. It was existential. Small transformations followed everywhere. Women who once hoarded bread now ate openly. Those who once hunched with shame now dared to lift their eyes. A few even joined in quiet games or tended small gardens with seeds given by guards. These were gestures so simple, yet to women who had been told they were expendable tools, they were revelations. Each act of kindness became a seed of doubt planted in their minds. If the enemy could treat them better than their own officers had, what did honor truly mean? If surrender could lead not to disgrace but to dignity, what else had the Empire lied about? The laughter over peanut butter, the sharpness of new spectacles, the warmth of a blanket at night. All these ordinary details stitched together into something extraordinary. The slow reawakening of humanity. But with that awakening came turmoil, for to embrace this kindness was to question everything they had been taught. Even as their bodies grew stronger under American care, the women's hearts wrestled with something far heavier. Food, blankets, medicine, and kindness could heal flesh, but not the wounds carved by years of indoctrination. Inside each of them raged a quiet war, the clash between shame and survival, honor and dignity. At night, when silence settled over the barracks, whispers carried through the darkness. Some women confessed they could not face their families again. "To surrender is unforgivable," one muttered, her voice breaking. Another admitted she had considered ending her life within the camp, believing death was still the only way to erase dishonor. The weight of Bushido, drilled into them since youth, was not easily shed. Yet others began to question. One prisoner, once struck by a superior for collapsing under fever, stared at the scar on her arm where an American doctor had treated her gently. "If the enemy values our lives," she whispered, "why do we not?" Her words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. For many, that single question was more destabilizing than hunger or wounds. Every kindness they received chipped away at the foundation of their beliefs. A bandage was not just cloth, it was proof that mercy existed. A letter home was not just ink, it was a voice preserved. A blanket was not just warmth, it was a recognition of worth. And yet, accepting these things felt dangerous, almost treasonous. To allow themselves comfort was to admit that their empire had lied. To taste dignity was to betray the code that demanded their death. The women carried this paradox daily. By day, they ate with hesitant gratitude. By night, they stared at the ceiling, their minds echoing with questions. What is honor if it demands suffering? What is loyalty if it ignores humanity? What is the value of sacrifice when life itself offers meaning? These were not idle doubts. They were fractures spreading silently through the rigid walls of ideology. The empire had promised that capture meant disgrace. But here, behind barbed wire, disgrace was replaced by something more subversive: hope. For the first time, these women confronted the possibility that they were more than servants of an emperor, more than tools of a war machine. They were individuals. They mattered. And once that thought took root, it could not be forgotten. When the war finally ended, the announcement reached the women in stunned silence. Japan had surrendered. The empire that had demanded their deaths rather than captivity had bowed its head. They sat motionless in the barracks, staring at the floor, unsure if the words could be trusted. Outside, the barbed wire still framed their view, but its meaning shifted. It no longer marked them as prisoners of an ongoing war. It marked them as witnesses to its end. Repatriation began slowly. Convoys of trucks, trains, and ships carried them back toward a homeland they had not seen in years. On one such ship, a young nurse clutched the few belongings the Americans had allowed her to keep: a blanket, a pair of spectacles, and the letter she had written to her mother. The sea stretched endlessly before her, gray and uncertain, just like the future awaiting her on shore. Would she be welcomed as a survivor, or condemned as a traitor? The Japan they returned to was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, reduced to ash and twisted steel. Families starved, children chewed bark to dull their hunger, and whispers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki haunted every street. Amid this devastation, the women carried with them memories that felt almost obscene. Warm meals, clean sheets, doctors who cared, guards who allowed them to laugh. Captivity had offered more dignity than freedom, and that contrast gnawed at them relentlessly. Some tried to speak of their experiences, cautiously describing the kindness of their captors. Their words were met with suspicion, sometimes even anger. To admit that the enemy had treated them with humanity was to unravel the story the empire had woven for years. A few women chose silence, burying their memories deep, fearful that their families would view them with shame. Others, however, could not remain quiet. They whispered in corners, telling neighbors that American guards had remembered their names, that music had drifted through the nights, that letters home had been allowed. These small confessions planted seeds of doubt in a society struggling to rebuild. For some, the experience became a turning point. They no longer believed honor was measured by suffering. They questioned the worth of sacrifice when it only produced ash and hunger. A handful even became advocates for peace, their voices quiet but insistent. They told their children that kindness could be stronger than cruelty, that dignity did not require obedience to an emperor. Yet not all could carry the weight. Some women were shunned, their captivity treated as a permanent stain. Others carried their memories silently, allowing them to shape the way they raised families, but never daring to speak of it openly. Still, the transformation lingered. The spectacles, the letters, the blankets they had carried home became more than objects. They were symbols of a truth larger than war itself. Historians later noted that humane treatment of prisoners had provided the Americans with more than intelligence or propaganda. It had sown doubt in the hearts of those who once followed their empire without question. Some argued that this quiet revolution may have shortened the war, saving countless lives. But for the women themselves, the legacy was not strategic. It was personal. They had tasted dignity, and once tasted, it could not be forgotten. The young nurse, now home in a ruined village, sat one evening beside her mother. Together they boiled weeds for soup, the broth thin and bitter. Hesitantly, she spoke of the camp, the meals, the music, the spectacles that had sharpened her vision. Her mother wept, not from shame, but from relief. "At least," she whispered, "someone remembered you were human." That was the cruelest irony of all. The empire had promised glory and delivered starvation. The enemy had promised nothing and delivered kindness. For the women who lived through this paradox, war could never look the same again. In the end, what unsettled the women most was not the food, the blankets, or the music. It was the idea hidden within each act of kindness, that their lives, as individuals, mattered. For years they had been told they were tools of an empire, expendable parts in a war machine. Yet in captivity, they discovered something their own commanders had denied them: dignity. That revelation was more dangerous than any weapon. Once tasted, dignity could not be erased. It lived on in the memory of a clean bandage, in the laughter over peanut butter, in the simple act of seeing the world clearly through a pair of spectacles. It lived on in letters that told families, "I am alive, I am treated kindly," even when those letters were intercepted. It lived on in the quiet nights when music replaced orders, when silence itself felt like freedom. The empire had demanded death before dishonor, but the Americans had shown that life preserved with humanity could be more powerful than sacrifice. That paradox followed the women home, shaping the way they spoke to their children, the way they understood loyalty, the way they remembered war. And so, their story does not end with the tearing down of barbed wire. It lingers in the whispers of their testimonies, in the contradictions they carried, in the fragile objects they brought back as symbols of an unexpected truth. If paradise could exist inside a prison, what did that say about the world outside? If enemies could offer dignity, what did that say about the meaning of honor? And if compassion could survive even in war, what might it achieve in peace?